John was exiled to the island of Patmos when he received this marvelous revelation. Jesus appeared to him and gave him a view of the future. On today's program, we're going to move into Revelation chapter 17 and 18. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me the rise and fall of Mystery Babylon.
Thanks, J.R. And of course, as we come to Revelation 17 and 18, we arrive at a culmination. J.R., the theme here is that of the destruction of the great harlot, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. And we cannot say that she came to life in the book of Revelation. Rather, she comes to her death in Revelation. Her life began centuries, even millennia before that.
According to chapter 17, John is taken out in the wilderness to see a woman sitting upon a scarlet-colored beast. This beast, Gary, appears to be the one of Revelation chapter 13 that rises up out of the sea of humanity, namely a one-world government. And she's riding this beast to its glory days.
You know, what's fascinating, J.R., about this beast is that there have been attempts to, shall we say, launch this beast, maybe to resuscitate it, to give it life, all the way down through history, starting with Nimrod, Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar, and then through the Greek and the Persian empires, the Roman Empire. They all attempted to govern the world, or to bring the world under one dominating authority, which I think is what this beast stands for. But they never succeeded. In fact, they still haven't to this day, which doesn't mean that they won't. And I think that we're getting close to that time.
The Mystery Babylon herself is a world city, what we would call a megalopolis, a group of cities. To me, Gary, it stands for at least two things. One, a world economy, and the other, a world religion.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and that's what we have here when we begin chapter 17. And there came one of the seven angels which had the seven vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters. These many waters, of course, symbolically are the nations. She's dominant over the nations, the megalopolis, the global village, the one world government, if you will. And the angel is talking with John, which is fascinating because the 17th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which gives its theme to Revelation chapter 17, is the Peh. Peh is the Hebrew word for mouth, and the Peh stands for the speech, or the mouth and speech, in particular, a proclamation of some sort. And you know, this whole chapter is a proclamation against Mystery Babylon the Great.
In the concluding verse of chapter 17, we are told that the woman is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth. So it is a world government, a worldwide empire, and I think headed up by the Antichrist. We see this woman as mystery. Tell us about the mystery, Gary.
Well, J.R., to me, and the idea of mystery is found all the way through the Bible, but in the New Testament, the word mystery is used 22 times. And by the way, that would be one word for each letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and we find that they correspond to those meanings. This just happens to be the mystery that relates to the letter Sheen, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. Sheen stands for divine power, but also it can be perverted into corrupt power, depending on the circumstances. So this mystery, this particular mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, is the mystery of corruption, or as it's called elsewhere, the mystery of iniquity, which basically has ruled this world since time immemorial.
Now, this would take us back to the Tower of Babel, wouldn't it?
It would indeed. And we've commented about this in the past, that the Tower of Babel was an attempt to link the powers of heaven with the powers of earth, and to form an empire that couldn't be toppled. It was corruption at the highest, and the goddess, well, we see the goddess in all sorts and manners of ways down through the Bible. Ashtoreth of the Old Testament, Diana of the Ephesians in the book of Acts. She was called Artemis in the Greek, and J.R., she was called the Tower Goddess, and she stood for power, that is, the power of the heavens.
The Tower of Babel goddess.
Yeah.
The goddess of fertility.
The goddess of fertility, sure.
And so naturally she would be depicted here with fornication, with all manner of uncleanness and immorality. And she is drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. So wickedness at its most, at its zenith, at its highest point, wickedness and in its most corrupt form.
And it's fascinating, J.R., that you can take truth and turn it upside down on its head and it becomes corruption. And I guess we could say about this final global empire is that it will claim to be the empire of truth and of righteousness that will finally bring justice to all men, and yet it'll be absolutely nothing but lying and corruption.
Now, Gary, an interesting thing here occurs. This beast upon which she rides, we feel, is the one out of Revelation chapter 13 that rises up out of the sea of humanity, representing the nations. Here it is said that this beast, in verse 8, shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is. So here we have the beast upon which she rides, but it's kind of interesting here that this beast which carries her is now narrowed down and depicted by the Antichrist himself.
Yeah, and he is featured as being the beast that was, is not, and yet is. Now this is a riddle. Nothing. It's like the riddle of the Sphinx. You know, what is this Sphinx-like character here? And yet, the riddle, we have some clues, like every good riddle. We have 7 heads, being 7 mountains on which the woman sitteth. There are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, 1 is, the other is not yet come, and when he cometh he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, is of the 7, and goes into perdition. And you know, J.R., that's a clue.
Yes, it is.
It's because there's one good clue. There is one of these kings who's on the throne as John writes this, because it says, and one is. Well, we know from history that the one who was on the throne when John wrote Revelation was the Emperor Domitian, who was a great persecutor of Christians.
Now, let's look at these 7 briefly for a moment. There are 7 kings, and to me, Gary, since the one who is sitting on the throne at that time is Domitian, those before him must be in ages past. And so we've decided that the best way to describe this would be the persecutors of the Jews down through history. And among them, of course, would be Nebuchadnezzar, the destroyer of Solomon's temple.
And there are some possibilities. Cyrus and Alexander the Great, although they did not directly persecute the Jews, Pharaoh would be a good possibility, though which Pharaoh? Perhaps the Pharaoh of the oppression would be a good possibility.
Certainly Antiochus for Epiphanes, he sacrificed a pig on the altar at Jerusalem.
And Nero was the first great Roman persecutor of the Jews. He started rumors, and then when the rumors succeeded in spreading, he raised up a great persecution of the Jews in his day.
Now Domitian was the 6th one. Gary, there is a 7th yet to come, and then the 8th, the Antichrist.
The way this is written, J.R., is very interesting because 5 are fallen. I believe the last of those was probably Nero. 1 is, Domitian was on the throne when John wrote Revelation. That would have to be the one who is. The other is not yet come, and when he cometh he must continue a short space. Well, after Domitian, there was a gap of many centuries, and Hitler came and was the great persecutor of the Jews in the modern era. It says that he must continue a short space. After that then, and the beast that was and is not, even he is the eighth and is of the seven. He must be similar to the preceding seven in some way.
So we have arrived at that moment in history when we await the rise of the eighth. John tells us that the eighth, the Antichrist, is of the seven. What do you think about that, Gary?
Well, J.R., this would ordinarily mean that there's some genealogical connection. It could well be just exactly that. There could be a genealogical connection back to the rulers of Rome.
Wow. Now, John went into the future and he saw these people.
Yes, he
Is
did.
it possible he recognized one?
It's very possible he recognized one, and that one may have looked like some of the earlier ones.
That now we are told that these kings will make war with the Lamb. That is, they are anti-God, anti-Christ. They are determined that Jesus will not rule as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. They evidently head up the armies at Armageddon against Jesus.
Apparently so, and the interesting thing is that the stakes are very high here. At this point in time, there will be a global government, and it will be an all-or-nothing kind of affair. And this is exactly the way it's depicted. That is to say, the rulers of the nations have put virtually all their assets on the table and said, this is it, this is our final hour.
Now, you know, Gary, the eighth one here, the eighth of the seven, that goes into perdition, he then immediately describes 10 horns, which are 10 kings that have received no kingdom as of yet. In other words, these are future kingdoms that are with the eighth of the seven that are listed here.
And by the way, this makes a very good case for these not being nations, because if they were nations, they would have had rulers before this. These, in fact, may well be divisions or subdivisions of world power that are handed out by the chief ruler, the supreme ruler, the Antichrist.
Now, what is so remarkable about this is that in 1973, I think it was, the Club of Rome issued a report, a book called Mankind at the Turning Point, wherein they suggested that the world be divided up into 10 kingdoms, which were later changed to 10 political economic regions. And the United Nations has been following that plan ever since. And with NAFTA and GATT, everything is moving toward a monetary division of the world into 10 economic regions. And it fits perfectly with what is being said here, Gary.
Exactly, because they have received no kingdoms yet. Now, these would be high bureaucracies, and they would be doing the bidding of the Antichrist on a global level. We're talking about global real-time world banking, global real world-time communication. We're talking about possibly the internet being developed even to a much higher state than it is now, global television via the internet. Everything the Antichrist needs to do his bidding. Then with these 10 regional controllers, he would think that he's got everything set up just the way he wants it.
But the next chapter tells us that this woman is going to be destroyed, falling under the judgment of God. Her name, Mystery Babylon, chapter 18. And Gary, the Hebrew letter that fits this chapter is the Tzadi.
That's right. Tzadi, which is the name of the letter. It also is the name of righteousness. For example, a tzaddik is a righteous man. So Tzadi, the letter of righteousness, is emblazoned on chapter 18 here, which has Babylon the Great being destroyed. And J.R.?
So this is the triumph of the righteous.
Triumph of the righteous, or the triumph of righteousness. We have here in verse 21, I beg your pardon, verse 23, and the light of the candle shall shine no more at all in thee. So we have the light of Mystery Babylon the Great being extinguished. Now, that light has been burning for millennia, ever since the days of Nimrod, ever since the days of evil, and it's been burning away, and now suddenly just like you took your fingers and pinched a candle wick, it's just put out.
The interesting thing about this also is that the voice of the bridegroom and the bride shall be heard no more at all in thee. So to me, the gospel is finished. I mean, the last person has been saved that God wants to be saved, and now God's judgment is going to fall on this world. And Gary, this great city has, in my opinion, cannot be any one single city that is destroyed.
And I feel exactly the same way, because if you examine the great city, first mentioned, by the way, in Revelation 16:19, and then mentioned again in Revelation 17:18, and then mentioned by inference in Revelation 18, that city has to cover the entire globe. And if you destroyed any small part of it, the rest would continue to operate. For example, if the headquarters were in Rome and you wiped out Rome with a nuclear bomb, you'd still have Tokyo, Bonn, you'd have London, you'd have New York. Financial capitals would still be operating. If you destroyed New York, say, for example, calling New York that great city, well, then the rest of the cities would take over. So this has to be the global village that is destroyed all at once, and that has to be a major cataclysm.
I see this as Armageddon. I feel that the cities of the world will fall in this great global conflict, and God will bring his judgment of fire upon all of these major cities. He says in verse 4, "Come out of her, my people." So there are converts during the tribulation period that will leave these cities for the countryside, lest they be caught up in the slaughter.
Absolutely, J.R. We have here a last call to righteousness, as it were, in the chapter represented by the Tzadi, the righteous letter. We have a very, I guess you could say, the final hour for redemption here. And I believe there are some of those who will be saved, as Jude says, as by fire, at the very last part of the tribulation.
Now we have the merchants of the seas standing on board their ships, watching the burning of this great city. And they pour ashes on their heads and weep. And Gary, this can only mean one thing. Babylon is connected with the great ships that carry goods from one country to another, the import-export business. And I see this today as the international banking cartel, the international oil cartel, the international industry, and it's all brought to a halt. No wonder they're weeping. They're out of business. That's what it means.
You know, J.R., today, they're called the merchants of Tarshish in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, they are the shipmasters who ply the seven seas, and they operate under lex mercatoria, the law of the merchant, which does not pay allegiance to any country. It is rather the law of the high seas. And I think that's what we have here. And yet, they're out there on the sea, and if the financial capitals are destroyed, so is the law merchant destroyed. And J.R., they're casting dust on their heads. Revelation 18:19, they cast dust on their heads and cried, weeping and wailing, saying, "Alas, alas, that great city wherein were made rich all that had ships in the sea by reason of her costliness. For in 1 hour she made desolate." What a catastrophe. And where did they get the dust to cast on their heads if they're out there in the middle of that sea? That's what I wonder.
Well, I can't tell you that, but
Well,
I can.
J.R., I've always thought there must be a catastrophe so great that dust covers the earth, as in a giant eruption of volcanoes or something, to be able to get dust right out in the middle of the sea.
Yeah. But the sad thing about it is, they who have been so wicked and have been haters of God and haters of Christians have now been judged. And God is a just God. But, you know, there is a sad note here that no longer will they have the opportunity to receive Christ. No longer will they have the opportunity to be forgiven. It is up to you and me to win as many people as we can, because there's coming a day when nobody else is going to be able to be saved. It'll all be over. And so we need to do our best to win people to Christ. Isn't that the message, I think, of the hour?
It's the message of the hour. Do you hear the last call? Because as we get into Revelation 18, we indeed have the last call. The wise shall hear and understand. You know, J.R., there is something here that is very striking. Thus with violence, verse 21, shall that great city Babylon be thrown down, and shall be found no more at all. Now, there's a finality in that statement. Never again will there be this world system that we now see. We take it for granted. One of these days, it's going to disappear.
Through all of this, what I call Armageddon, every mountain will be leveled, every house leveled. There won't be any place to hide. There'll be some underground facilities. People will try to flock into them, but that's just for a very few people. But Jesus Christ is about to return, which we will see in our next chapter on our next program, and he will win the day and become King of Kings and Lord of Lords. What a prospect. We'll be back in just a moment.